All right, everyone. As promised, or as maybe slightly hinted at, I am going to do a Q&A. It's been a long time since I did one of these. I've done a few of them when I live streamed, but it's been I think a couple of years since I did a proper Q&A in a recorded format like this, a bit more controlled. And so I thought I'd sit down, partly because I don't have any content planned for this weekend, but also because I do enjoy answering questions and interacting with you in the audience to such a degree. So we're here in this beautiful place. I think this is actually essentially the same place where I recorded the first Q&A ever on the channel many years ago, which is a nice full circle moment perhaps. But anyway, I'm going to jump right into it and look at some of your questions. And of course, I'm going to prioritize the questions that I received from my Patreon community over on patreon.com. This is one of those privileges that you get if you're a patron. I asked both in my public channel but also my Patreon, so I'm going to go through all of the questions from the patrons first, and then I'm going to try to get to as many of the public questions as possible. So first question from D. Rack, just posted 12 minutes ago, so you're lucky that you were just in time for this recording. He asked, why would some people consider Ibn Arabi a monist or a pantheist, I suppose, or a panentheist? I have heard all of these labels put to him, even though he was a practicing Orthodox Muslim. That's a good question. I think you can see, especially reading something like the Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom, you can see why a lot of people would interpret that in a sort of pantheistic way. And even in my in my video about pantheism, I do include Ibn Arabi in that discussion under a definition of pantheism that is very broad, where we go by this very basic and incredibly broad definition of God as everything, that God is all that there is. And that Ibn Arabi would certainly agree with. And while I usually don't use the word pantheism for Ibn Arabi, because I feel like pantheism usually is understood as that, just the sum total of the universe is God, and that's certainly not what he says. The universe is, he defines it as that which God isn't, that which isn't God, right? But monist, I've sort of come around on, I sometimes do call Wahdat al-Wujud a kind of monism, because it does posit that there is just one being, one existence, which is God, the truth, al-Haq. But it's not a monism in the sense that maybe most people... I think the problem with these terms is not necessarily that they are inaccurate all of the time, but that they have certain associations for most people in a certain context like the West. And that particular association that those words have do not always carry over onto someone like Ibn Arabi, who comes from a very different intellectual and mystical background, right? Panentheist, I think, is closer to what he's getting at, because while there is only God and the world is just a sort of manifestation, this fleeting fluctuation of God's self-reflection, God is, of course, much bigger than that. God transcends that. It's this constant play between the tanzih, the transcendence, and the tashbih, the immanence of God, and how they play and sort of they play into each other, so to say. And that's really not something that's usually a factor in pantheism, maybe more so in panentheism, I suppose. Your last point, him being an Orthodox Muslim, well, that sort of already has a built-in assumption that an Orthodox Muslim couldn't be a pantheist. And there's argument why that could be the case, but if Ibn Arabi was a pantheist, which I don't believe one should call him that, but then, per definition, an Orthodox Muslim like Ibn Arabi could be a pantheist because, he was that too, right? He was a very strictly observing Muslim. He was very strict about following the Sharia, etc. as most Sufis were and are. But his specific way of reading the Quran and the Hadith and understanding the theological tenets of Islam leads him to those positions that many read as pantheistic or as pantheistic adjacent, monist, perhaps, which I am more inclined to use as a term for him, even though I'm careful with that term too, much more so than pantheism. But I think it's, so to go back to answer your question, is that I think the way he expresses himself in these very unitive ways naturally lends itself to interpretations or for people with certain associations of going to terms like pantheism and monism, even though they can be problematic. I hope that answers that question. It's something that I sort of wrestle with myself. Like, for example, when I did the pantheism videos, like, do I include Ibn Arabi here or not? And like when I use words like monism, like, should I use that word or not? I've become more open to using some of those terms in the last couple of years, but always with the sort of caveats regarding what I mean when I use them and so on. But thank you for that question. It's an important one, that we don't oversimplify someone like Ibn Arabi. Anas Quraish asks, what are, in your opinion, the main differences between Christian Catholic saint worship and that by the Sufis? This is a question that I've also had a lot of discussions with friends and acquaintances and people. And it's a hard one because neither sides have a set way of doing things when it comes to, in Catholicism, like saint worship or saint reverence, or whatever word you want to use, and the reverence for the awliya in Sufism, which are sometimes called Sufi saints. But that word is often avoided, especially by Muslims themselves, precisely because they don't want that to be construed with saint veneration. That's the word, veneration in Catholicism. The difference between them, it depends. I mean, so in Islam, there are these questions regarding intercession, shafa, I believe is the word in Arabic, as well as istighatha. And while many modern Muslims, like the Salafi movement, for example, are generally skeptical of those kinds of practices, of this idea that a prophet, especially a saint, a wali, can intercede on your behalf. Traditionally, in Islamic theology, that was quite widely accepted, right? Even though we find voices that are critical, that are more skeptical, this was something that was widely practiced, right? But it is practiced in different ways by different people, right? Some people do it very modestly, like just going to the grave of a great wali, and they will simply use that as a way to remember, their great deeds and be inspired by them. Others will, ask for them to intercede on their behalf. There are even examples, even though this is not necessarily accepted theologically, or I could be wrong, I'm sure there are some who would, but there are some who even ask more directly from the saint for certain things, or from the wali, right? And so there's a variety of different ways of approaching it within Islam and Sufism, just as there's a variety of ways of approaching it within Catholicism. So it's hard to say or to pinpoint what the differences are. It certainly is more widely accepted in Catholicism. It's even, this is something that is, a saint in Catholicism is canonized, usually, by the Pope. So officially from the Vatican, here's like, this person is officially a saint, and he can intercede, and you can pray to this saint for certain things, etc. At least as an intercessionary figure. Whereas in Islam, there is no such canonization, right? The way the awliya become the awliya, the so-called saints or friends, is a much more organic thing. They figure in a certain environment, in a certain locale, and they become venerated as a wali in that circumstance. And then, so it's much more ad hoc. It's much less structured in Sufism. So in terms of the differences, I can't really answer that question properly, because, as I said, there are different approaches within each of the two sides, where sometimes they seem to be very similar, sometimes they are very different, and it all depends. So in Islam, for example, there is this idea that on the Day of Judgment, the Prophet Muhammad has the opportunity to intercede on the behalf of his community. That even though you've sinned, you've been a bad person, Muhammad can intercede on your behalf. He can choose to, intercede so that God may pardon you, right? So that idea exists in Islam, that the Prophet has that ability, and so you can pray for the Prophet and for his blessings, for his well-being, but also for him to intercede on your behalf. So that exists for the Prophet, and that that power of intercession is often extended to the awliya. So that's how it is theologically, justified. And again, some people, especially Salafis, would be critical of that today, at least certain aspects of that. This goes back to Ibn Taymiyyah and people like that who even back in medieval times were critical, even though not as critical as some of the Salafis are today. But he was certainly critical of many of the ways in which these kinds of visits to the grave sites of saints were carried out back then. Next question here is from Joel Zahn. When reading a text of personal spiritual importance, how difficult do you find it to conduct historical critical analysis on that work? Love the channel. Thank you. Of personal spiritual importance. I mean, yeah, this is one of those questions, and it's a question that often is relevant in academia, for example. In many parts of academia, when you study things like religion, it is seen as beneficial for you not to be personally invested in the thing that you're studying. Even though there's no rule that you can't do that, obviously, but that is often a factor. And when you're doing field work, for example, you're studying a certain culture or a certain group of people, there's this, I don't want to use the word stigma, but there's this thing that you're not supposed to go native, so to say, right? Because that will compromise your scientific neutrality and objectivity. I mean, that's also kind of an old-fashioned thing. I think a lot of people today in academia are moving away from that, and there is, in some circles, a greater emphasis on the idea of the scholar practitioner, especially in fields like yoga and Indian religions and so on. And there are arguments for the opposite too, that right, if you belong to a community, you're better able to understand the intricacies and nuances, especially the phenomenological aspects of such a tradition, and thus be able to portray it even more accurately because you have a personal insight into it. So there are arguments on both sides. For me personally, it's not something that I really think much about these days. I think because, and I guess we'll get into that also in this discussion, is that I don't, my personal stance in terms of my religious affiliation hasn't really changed much. Even, there are texts, of course, that are personally inspirational to me or that I like on a personal level. For me, I don't think that ever gets in the way. I think that helps because it makes me more inspired to talk about them. And I think I know people have noticed when I talk about a topic that I'm especially passionate about, right? Because it comes out in the way I talk about it and so on. And for me, I think that's been mostly a positive thing, or is a positive thing. And I try to be that engaged for everything that I talk about and really get into it. And I do feel like that for most of the things that I talk about, that I am passionate about them and that I'm very interested in them. Sometimes that passion sort of is even greater for certain topics. And that helps me, I think, stay focused. It helps me broaden my sources and my information so that I can present as much about the topic as I can. So I think, speaking from personal experience, I don't think that ever gets in the way. I think quite the opposite in many ways. Although you also always have to check yourself and make sure that you're not letting those subjective feelings about a topic seep in too much. Even though, as I've stated many times, I don't believe that there is any such thing. There's no such thing as complete neutrality or complete objectivity when talking about these topics. I think that's still something that we should, and I do strive for, to be as objective and as neutral as possible. And for that, you of course need to keep track of your subjective feelings on topics that you talk about. But I'd like to think I do a decent job of that, but you'd have to be the judge. So mostly my experience is that I benefit from being personally invested or interested in things in that way. All right, next question from Elizabeth Groff. What was the role of Islam in Byzantine iconoclasm? Also, what was the role of Hindu images of gods and Eastern Islam on their art with images of humans? Seems a lot more than Sunni art. That's certainly true that there's often talk about this idea in Islam that you're not supposed to depict humans or animals. And while that is certainly true that is a tendency and a factor within Islam, it's also a lot more nuanced than a lot of people believe. So there are different schools in Islam with different opinions on that. So for example, I know that my at least impression reading historically has been that the Maliki school of law in Islam is more allowing of images than some of the other schools. And the Shi'i branch of Islam, the Jafari school, and I think the Ismailis also to a degree, has been also especially allowing of images. We see that in many of the depictions of the Imams, of the Prophet Muhammad. There are many famous paintings of the Prophet from the Shi'i, the sort of Safavid and Qajar periods in Iran, for example. I don't know, I don't think, I've never heard of any direct influences from Hindu art in terms of depictions of the gods in Hinduism on Shia Islam in that way. That I guess it's possible, but it's not something that I've ever encountered as an argument or in scholarship. Now, in terms of Islam's influence on Byzantine iconoclasm, that I know is something that scholars have been looking at a lot more. And that is not something I'm an expert on either, particularly iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire. But I know there are different opinions regarding how much Islam may have influenced it. I think the general opinion is that it's not something that was a direct influence on it, but certainly it contributed to the environment in the area at that time, which led to iconoclasm. But that's really as far as I know. Hello. That's really all I know about that topic. It's not something that I've had time to study properly yet, but certainly I think the attitude of Islam and the influence of Islam and its ideas, among them, ideas about depiction and the iconoclastic attitude of Islam in certain ways, probably contributed to that in an indirect way rather than a direct way. But again, I'm speaking outside of my field of expertise here. Okay, Jerry asks, or says, one of my interests is the intersection of religion and science. This includes Christianity and evolution, the proven effects of Buddhist meditation, the investigation of children who remember past lives in the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, and parts of the Vedas that have been validated scientifically. I'd love you to take up this arena at some point. It's interesting. I was recently in Italy. I should say, first of all, that I'm also very much interested in this, although natural science is not something that I am well versed in the same way that I am in comparative religion. But I was recently in Italy, in Rome and Milan and Naples, and the reason I was supposed to go originally was that I was invited to attend, as an audience member, a conference that was being held at the Vatican in June that was centered around particularly this topic of the relationship between faith and science, religion and science. Topics like mysticism and mystical experience and neuroscience and all these kinds of topics. And that I was really interested in what those speakers were going to say about that. Unfortunately, it was cancelled due to different circumstances. As you know, there's a lot going on in the Vatican this year, and so hopefully that'll be, they'll be able to do that again in the future. But yes. Certainly a topic that I am also interested in. And I think that will also sort of bring things back a bit more to the way that relationship worked historically. I mean, today we've inherited this very Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment idea of the separation between religion as something superstitious and old-fashioned, and science, on the other hand, which are like polar opposites of each other. And I think a lot of people still sort of hold on to that dichotomy, which was not the way it worked historically, right? Where religion and philosophy and science were all sort of the same thing, even though, of course, many would argue that science, in terms of the scientific method, evolved much later, but still, you get my idea, right? That there's a sort of holistic search for truth that can include all these different aspects. And I think having those things in dialogue with each other is very beneficial. And so I look forward to more of that in the future. Ali A asks, so first of all, he asks, will you do more on Seekism and figures like Kabirji, Guru Arjan, and Guru Gobind? Sikhi seems like the only actual perennialist religion which is based on divine union and love with no intercessors, dogma, or superstitions involved. Not sure I fully agree with that second paragraph, but I love Sikhism. I think Sikhism is a beautiful and a very interesting religion. And all the Sikhs I met in my life have been wonderful, kind, and beautiful people. And so I would love to go further into Sikhism on the channel in the future. There are no current direct plans or videos or episodes in the works, but this is definitely something that I want to do. So yes. He has a second question, which is also, when you visited certain shrines, were there any feelings of spiritual boosts, or like even while visiting Konya, was there any feeling of divine love near Rumi's maqam? Maqam is a word for his sort of grave site, his tomb. I don't know if I would use the word spiritual boosts. Maybe they are, actually. I mean, certainly you can't help but tune into some of that energy and the feelings that are in places like that. And that could be completely internal, the things just... Because when you study someone like that and you admire someone like Rumi, for example, you've studied their poetry, their life for so many years, and then you get to enter the place where he is laid to rest. There is undeniably a lot of emotion going into that. And so when I visited Rumi the first time in Konya, it was a very strong experience, a very strong feeling, very emotionally charged for me as well as you get swept up in the environment and all the people around you who are having similar experiences, who are having these very profound spiritual moments. And of course, you're affected by that as well. And maybe there is something to those places. I mean, whether that is something external that we experience or something that just, how should I put it, that sort of sparks up from the inside because of our past experiences and so on. Whatever the case, in many of those places that I visit, not just Sufi shrines, but many of these temples and historic religious places of religious and spiritual significance, you do feel things. Certainly, at least I do, and many people that I've spoken with, you can't help but feel certain feelings that could certainly be interpreted as spiritual as well, I suppose. But yes, no. bottom line, yes, visiting those places can be very powerful, even for myself. I have 2 questions from Carlos. It's starting to rain. I might have to move inside, actually. But 2 questions from Carlos. Will you do a remake on the Quranist video? That's actually a pretty good idea. I might do that at some point. Many of those videos from the early days of the channel I want to redo because they're often very short. They're very... I mean, they're not bad, but like I know more now, and I think I've come into this place on my channel where I do prefer doing these longer, very in-depth videos. And so I think some of those topics deserve more in-depth discussions. Secondly, he asks when I will do the Ibadism video. So Ibadi Islam, this is like maybe sometimes seen as a third major branch of Islam. There's the Sunni, the Shia, and the Ibadi. I did a video on the Ibadis, also in the early days of the channel. A video that I'm still happy with for the most part. So if you didn't know that existed, then go check that out. But I do want to make another one. That is one of those that I actually plan to make another one of. And I actually have ambitions to go to Oman. And Oman is the place where most Ibadis are. There are a lot of Ibadis in Oman, and also a sizable group in North Africa, and places like Algeria in particular, I believe. But I want to go to Oman. Maybe, this is no promise, and there are no direct, concrete plans yet. But I do want to go maybe sometime early next year to Oman and spend a couple of weeks there, and among other things, to make another updated version of the Ibadism video on location in Oman. That's like an ambition that I have. So hopefully I will get to that. Regardless, that video is going to happen unless, my channel is closed down or something. That's in the works, if only in the planning stage still. But yes, Ibadism, definitely, I'm going to get back to. Okay, DS. I'm all wet, but I think the rain stopped, so maybe I can remain outside for a while. DS asks, do you have any advice for people who want to make academic content on YouTube on a subject that's full of misconceptions, especially when getting started? I guess there are a couple of things. Number one is that I've found that people appreciate quality and integrity, especially in today's climate when you have so much on YouTube that is simply, and all the power to them. I'm not, they're very successful for a reason, and I wish them all the best. But there are a lot of channels that only sort of seek your attention through, clickbait and so on. But also the rise of things like AI and AI content, and you already see a lot of that on YouTube. Even in my field on YouTube, there's a lot of AI videos. And so I think the counter reaction to that, although some will embrace AI, and I think a lot of people will also seek out things that's the sort of contrary to AI. So they want a more, as human of a connection as possible. And so a couple of things is that number one is that I would put focus on having the content, the information that you present be, as you mentioned, academic, reliable, trustworthy, you cite your sources. That's going to, even though it may take time, right? People will appreciate that, that integrity, that consistency. And consistency is the second thing. I'm not as consistent anymore as I was, but in the early days of my channel, what I found really helped grow the channel, and this is something that everyone will say, but my experience was that it's actually true, is that consistency is very important, that you have a semi-regular upload schedule. So for a while I would do one video a week for like a year and a half, and then I got kind of burnt out, so I had to tone it down, but still, to have some sort of regular schedule, that the videos are coming out regularly. It doesn't have to be the exact same day every week, but even though that also probably helps, but having that consistency, I think, really helps. So focusing on having the content be academically reliable and good, as well as having that sort of human aspect, that maintaining that human connection with the audience, which is what people will, I think, gravitate towards with the rise of AI, and then also consistency. That would be my spontaneous recommendations and tips. I hope that helps. Really, I'm not the person to ask. Maybe I am, but I know I know what I'm doing in terms of the content. I know how to edit a video. I know how to research a video and write and present it. But in terms of why my channel is successful, I feel like I have no idea what I'm doing. Right? I learn by doing, and I've done this for a couple of years now, so I think I've gotten into some sort of groove, but it's not like I follow a certain formula that I figured out and it works. It's all just, it feels like chance to me, although it probably isn't. But from my experience, that's all I can really say. So I hope that was somewhat helpful. That was all the patron questions. So now we can move into at least trying to answer some of the questions from the general audience. I'm going to head over to this. Okay, I might move through these a bit quicker. And also, a lot of them, as always, are just questions about certain topics that you want me to cover. And so I'm going to skip most of those questions because the answer is usually yes, because I want to cover everything. So if you ask me if I want to do a video on, the Ahmadiyya community, then all those kinds of questions have the same answer, which is yes. Quinn Fisher, if you could be fluent in 5 languages for your study, which 5 would you choose? Okay, 5 languages. So I do read Arabic, but I wouldn't call myself fluent in Arabic. So Arabic is one. I have studied some Hebrew, so maybe Hebrew would be nice to be better at. This is hard, actually. Arabic, Hebrew, maybe Persian, especially for me studying Sufism. I think knowing Persian would be something I should get to at some point. I guess Greek would be nice, being able to read some of the old Greek texts, like the Enneads. And Chinese? I don't know. Picking 5 is difficult. I want to learn all these languages. So I would love to learn Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, Persian, Chinese. Syriac is nice too. I would love to learn Syriac and Latin. But if I had to pick 5 of them, Sanskrit would be nice. Arabic, Persian. Okay, let's do them. Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Greek, and Chinese. So that I can read Taoist text and stuff. That would be nice. That's very just off the top of my head, just had to pick a couple of them because any language I would love to learn. The reason I picked those is that those are the kind of languages related to topics that I study a lot. So that makes sense. Jenna Foresty asks, how did you become interested in religion as a study topic? What is it about religion that keeps you interested going forward? If you could spend a day with any figure you've studied, having conversations, learning about their life, who would you like to visit and why? If there was one lost document that you could read, what would it be and why? Oh, these are good, hard questions. Might not get to all of them. How did I become interested in religion? I don't know, I've always been. I can't really pinpoint a moment. I mean, even in high school, I remember someone, a classmate or a fellow person at the school, student, they were doing some sort of survey, and they came up to me in the corridor and they were like, can I ask you some questions? I was like, yeah. And he asked me, do I believe in God? And I was just like, what do you mean by God? And and they were kind of annoyed with me, but I was like, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question if I don't know what it is that I'm supposedly believing in or not, or what that means. So even then, I was like thinking about those things a lot, and we did like a short film for a project there, and I wrote the script. I studied film, and it was just this guy going to his therapist talking about religion and God. So even back then, clearly, I had certain interests. Um, Studying it academically came almost as I've told this story before, I think, on my first Q&A too, but came almost accidentally because I was studying international relations and political science, and I had to take further courses for my points, and I heard that the institution or the university I was studying at had a good program, or like had good professors teaching religion, so I tried a course, and then after one lecture I was stuck. So that's kind of how that happened. And what it is about religion that keeps you interested in going forward? That's a good question. I mean, I think there is something about that sort of mystery and those questions baked into religion regarding just the very fundamental aspects of life and reality that gives it a lot of weight. I was talking to a friend, an old professor of mine, about this, how there is something about the study of religions that draws us to that topic. We're interested in that thing that I was just trying to describe, that flavor of religion, that mystery perhaps, that makes us study religion in particular. Otherwise, we might as well be sociologists or anthropologists, because they do the same stuff, mostly. It's the same work, they study the same things sometimes, but there's something about like religion that draws us to that topic in particular. And I think there's just something about that aspect of it that at least keeps me going, right? It affects the way it can affect the way you look at the world also, when you become personally affected by it, which it's inevitable that you will. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not sure that answered any of your questions, but those are my thoughts on that. Viewing 87291T says, has studying religions transformed your metaphysical understanding of the world? It probably has. I mean, I know it has, for sure. It gives me a language to talk about it, at least, I think, or different languages. Ways of conceiving it intellectually and in conversations. I already had a certain way of looking at things before I started studying it, I think. That hasn't changed all that much, I would say, in its fundamentals. Although, as I said, I think I've been given the language and the concepts to talk about it more. And of course, it has extended and expanded the way I look at things in different ways. But, I'm not going to get into any specifics today. I am Leo. Which argument do you think is the most convincing for the existence or non-existence of God? I've never been fully convinced by any rational argument in that way, but I think if there's one that I think is very clever, somewhat convincing, I think it is Ibn Sina's proof of the truthful, so to say. Ibn Sina's argument, which is an argument from contingency. And I think that argument, and it's the arguments that were born from it, generally is referred to the contingency argument, right? I'm not that well versed in all these terms, strangely enough. But it's this idea of positing that all things are contingent, so caused by something else or dependent on something else for its existence. Not temporally necessarily, but like just almost in a sort of Buddhist way, that for something to be what it is, it requires everything else making it what it is. There's always something that's causing every aspect of the world to be that particular thing. And so that we have to trace that back, and eventually, as Ibn Sina argues, we get to something that is a necessary existent, something that has to be and can't not be. And he also argues for why that necessary being can't be one of the units in the world. And it can't be the totality of the world, because the totality of the world, seen as a totality, is dependent on all its contingent parts. So it's dependent. It can't be dependent, it has to be necessary. Right? So I have a whole video on this argument. I think I'm quite partial to it. I think it's a very clever argument. And Ibn Sina, of course, is a genius. It's picked up by someone like Aquinas, although in a much more simpler form. And it's also been picked up by others in history. But Ibn Sina, as far as I know, is the one that sort of originates it, even though, of course, he bases it on like the Aristotelian first cause, first mover kind of argument. But he extends it in a way that I think is very beautiful and very clever. So that, if anything, I think it's that. Scotty Garner, what is the grander purpose or practical utility for you studying religions beyond just academic reasons? Does religion and different spiritual traditions for you mean something personally, or is it just an abstract academic endeavor for you? Have you yourself had any spiritual or religious experiences? You can answer all three. Okay. I mean, the fact that it is an academic, it has an academic purpose in life does not exclude it from also being a personal thing. I think academic search for truth is also a personal utility. It has personal meaning. They're not separated to me, but I think it's a similar thing to the other question that I just answered, and that, like, how has that affected me, or does it affect me? And the short answer is that it does, and that I do have a personal investment in, as everyone does, in questions of existence and of life and the meaning of all these things, and how to understand ourselves and our relation to the world around us and the grand mysteries. And I think the fact that religion, like theology and philosophy, and they approach those questions, they talk about them in different ways, and that's also what's so interesting, and they talk about it in different ways and from different approaches. And I think that whole just rainbow of different perspectives on how we should view ourselves and our relation to the world is really, there's something about that I'm really passionate about, personally as well. So I guess yes, it does mean something for me personally, but that's not separated from the academic aspect of it. Here is Hudud al-Mayari. Sorry. The question that everyone asks me over and over again, and I've replied to before as well. But since you talk about every religion in a neutral stance, what's your religion? And I don't talk about my personal affiliation much on the channel, partly because I talked about it in one of my Q&As back in the day, in the early days of the channel, and my stance hasn't really changed all that much since then. In that I don't ascribe to any particular religious tradition, even though I am personally engaged with many of the traditions that I study, and I'm interested in the teachings and the practices that they convey. But I'm not affiliated with any particular tradition. And that's what I'll leave it at. And conveniently, the next question here is from my good friend Zevi from Seekers of Unity. Hi Zevi, hope you're doing well. He says, What's a spiritual practice that you've come to appreciate? I think there are so many spiritual practices that are very valuable. And I've tried different, I meditate, I've done different things, of course, but I think what has been the most transformative for me on a spiritual level is a quite mundane thing, and it's just service to others. And I've talked about that a lot before in terms of a certain job that I had, for example, working with people, working with kids and so on. Everything, all the time that you've meditated, which probably helped that, or all the sort of spiritual practices that I've done, nothing compared to that sort of complete giving yourself up to serve someone else, to care for someone else that you care about. And so those kinds of teachings within religions I gravitate towards a lot also, is that I'm not interested in some mystic who can levitate. That's great, right? That's cool, I guess, but like, what are you actually helping people? Are you giving to charity, you know? We were in Morocco earlier this year, and we were visiting the grave of this great Sufi saint, Abu Abbas as-Sabti. There'll probably be a video coming out on him soon. He was a Sufi saint who died in the very early 1200s. And there are many stories about these kinds of saints and their miraculous deeds and their great mystical experiences that they have. And, you know, they travel to these worlds and they unite with, like, all these kinds of things. And that's wonderful. And I that can be a great tool, I suppose, for developing moral character and so on. But what he is famous for is not any of those experiences. I'm sure he had them. But what he did was that he just dedicated his whole life to serving the poor and to giving to those who were in need. And to me, that's the true sign of someone that is, what's the word I should use, like enlightened, or, you know, those kinds of things. Is that it should give you a greater reason to be present in this world and to help those who need help, who are less fortunate than yourself. I'm on a tangent now, but I think for me, having just a taste of that, when you can turn off the ego and actually help someone, to be there for someone, that is incredibly powerful when you can do it from a state of presence and mindfulness, so to say, broadly defined. To be mindful of your actions and use those kinds of mundane, maybe to some, things like work, when it is meaningful and in service of others, that can be used as a very powerful spiritual tool. At least that was the case for me. But of course, many other things like meditation and prayer can help you do that more mindfully. So it doesn't exclude other things. But I think that for me has been profound, let's say. There's a bee here. I'll try not to agitate him. Maddie B. Any common religious pet peeves that you wish more people were educated on or understood better? If there's anything, I think it's the most basic thing of understanding religion and religious studies is that religions are diverse, internally diverse. And this constant, what you see all the time is this essentializing of religions. Islam is this way, Christianity is this way. From people not even belonging to that religion. Islam is violent, you know. Buddhism is peaceful. those kinds of blanket statements that fail to recognize the internal diversity and constantly changing nature of religions. That gets on my nerves sometimes. But it's understandable, of course, but that's something that I really try hard to work against in my videos. Understanding that there is always, for every position within a religion, there is someone having the opposite position. That's a bit of hyperbole, but that's also kind of not. And that no one necessarily, at least from the perspective where I stand as an educator, as someone who studies religion, from an academic neutral perspective, no one actor has the right to fully represent or define that religion in a broad sense. But every person who belongs to religion and subscribes to religion creates that religion and defines that religion. And so there is no such thing as an essential monolithic religion that has certain characteristics. I mean, of course, we can talk about religion as having certain characteristics in a broad sense. That's not what I'm saying, but that very sort of strict essentializing that happens is like religion. The study of religions 101, and something that people get wrong a lot of the time, and do things like the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? This is the way Christianity is. Well, that guy doesn't seem to follow that. Well, he's not a real Christian. That kind of thing. Sulian Sculescu? Sorry, I'll put it on the screen. Are political ideologies secular religions? This also gets back to that question, how we even define a religion, which is difficult. And you can watch my video called What is Religion to get an overview of some of these discussions. If we follow a definition of religion from someone like Durkheim, like a sociological perspective on religion, something like a political ideology has sometimes essentially the exact same function as a religion. It functions in the same way, sociologically and in terms of identity, as a religion does. But most people wouldn't, I think, consider that a religion. There's something that distinguishes religion. So that's why a lot of those definitions we have of religion are lacking sometimes. And that topic of how we use the term religion is something that is still hotly debated in scholarship, and no one really agrees, either in scholarship or in the public. It's just this word that people use. So that really requires a lot longer of a discussion than this, but I don't know, I guess. Theron Jeremy? I'm familiar with the Islamic history of Spain, but what about Portugal? The scholarship I've tracked is almost exclusively focused on Al-Andalus, but I haven't found anything specifically addressing what was going on in modern-day Portugal in, say, the time of Ibn Masarra forward. Were there any hubs of proto-Sufi practices in Portugal? For example, what were Portuguese Islamic landscapes looking like post-Visigoths and pre-Catholic? And their relationship with MENA spiritual and religious communities. Thank you for everything. Well, thank you for everything. So when we say Andalus, that usually refers to what is today both Spain and Portugal, southern Spain and Portugal. So a lot was going on in the Portuguese part of Al-Andalus back then. But it is true that the majority of the activity that we know of, that is famous at least, happened in places like Cordoba and Sevilla and Granada, and which is on the Spanish side of things. In terms of Sufism, there is a very famous mystic from the 12th century, Ibn Qasi, who was in Portugal. I think he's buried there. He's one of these early mystics in Al-Andalus. I think Yusuf Keswit writes about him in his book on mysticism in Al-Andalus, which it's a book that's particularly focused on Ibn Barajan, who was a Sevillan mystic, but Ibn Qasi is also one of them, along with Ibn al-Arif. But Ibn Qasi, he was from Portugal, and he was this mystic who also started sort of political movement. He became sort of a military political leader who wanted to dethrone the Almohads and became the enemy of the Almohads. Sorry, not the Almohads, the Almoravids at that point. And he is defeated and executed. But he also wrote many of these mystical tracts and texts, and Ibn Arabi, for example, refers to him. And he had obviously read his works, and he refers to him in the Futuhat al-Makkiyya, I believe. He does not seem to be a big fan. He basically calls him a charlatan. But he was a very influential mystic, and I don't know if I would use the word Sufi necessarily, because at that point in Al-Andalus, these terms Sufi, and it wasn't really. Today we use Sufism to describe all of Islamic mysticism, essentially. That was not necessarily the case there. Sufism was a particular flavor of mysticism to someone like Ibn Arabi, associated primarily with the East. And when I say the East, I mean the Middle East, like Iraq and Syria, parts of Iran and Arabia. And that kind of tariqa Sufism that had come to Al-Andalus, someone like Abu Madian would be one of them, or would be a representative of a more sort of Sufi character. Ibn Qasi and Ibn Barajan and these people, they were more, you mentioned Ibn Masarra, they were more in that tradition, the Mu'tabirun, the contemplators sometimes called, which is more of a philosophically inclined, sort of speculative kind of mysticism, very inspired by Neoplatonism. Ibn Barajan was definitely representative of that. I think Ibn al-Arif too. Ibn Qasi, I think he's generally considered part of that wider movement, but not as much. He's more of a sort of, he has his own thing going on in some ways, but he's very interesting. He's very, very interesting, especially because he has that sort of political aspect too. I wanted to visit I think it's his grave, or at least some sort of memorial thing, when I was in Portugal earlier this year. But we were in Lisbon, and that place is much further south, and there wasn't time to visit. But he's the one that comes to mind as a very famous Islamic mystic from what is today Portugal. Here's a question: to what extent were the Presocratics a philosophical movement, or rather a religious or a mystical one? And I think the only way to approach that is to ask whether there's a difference necessarily between philosophical and religious. Those are categories that we use today that aren't necessarily relevant for that time period and context. It's sort of a bit of anachronistic, I think, to look at them as different. Like Parmenides, for example, you read his On Nature. Certainly it's a philosophical text. He's a very important early philosopher in terms of ontology, and he's the one that seems to come up with this idea of being, or like conceptualizes this idea of being, and some call him the first metaphysician in history. But his text begins with this clearly mystical experience where he's taken to the underworld to meet a goddess. And this is a common theme in many of these Greek traditions, catabasis, of going to the underworld and coming back and learning from this experience of going into the underworld, which is a very mystical and religious thing. He meets a goddess, and the goddess tells him these things, and it's a powerful, almost psychedelic kind of experience. So the lines between philosophy, mysticism, religion, very blurry. So I wouldn't say that's a helpful way of looking at it, to even ask whether there's a difference, if you know what I'm saying. Fanoth, this is one of those requests or questions about content that I said I wasn't going to answer, but this is framed in a different way that I think it's interesting. Do you plan to interview some saints or simple people practicing their spiritual paths that you're talking about in your videos? And that I can answer yes. That's actually what I wanted to do originally with the channel, was to have practitioners speak about their religion and not me, an outsider, just talking. Of course, I love doing it the way that I do it now. I'm not gonna stop doing it. But yes, I've been thinking actually quite a lot the last couple of months that I want to do some interviews with with practitioners, with representatives from different traditions. So hopefully I'll get to that soon. I'm not much of an interviewer. You know, I'm quite shy and careful, like introverted. So it's outside of my, it's contrary to my nature and outside of my comfort zone to do interviews sometimes, but that's of course why I should be doing them. So yes, I want to get into that. Okay, Nils Hagberg asks, Charlie XCS or Chapel Roan? The thing is, I haven't heard Charlie XCX music almost at all. I'm sure I've like encountered that stuff sometimes. So I don't really have much of an opinion. I have listened to Chapel Roan a lot more. And while it's not the kind of music that I usually listen to, it's not my cup of tea, I can recognize that it's very good pop music. And I think Good Luck Babe in particular is a very good song. So just based on the fact that I've been exposed to Chapel Roan a lot more than Charlie XCX, I'll have to go with Chapel Roan. But this is going to be the most controversial thing I say on the channel, probably. Zengin Tepe, is the study of the place of music in religious ritual something that interests you? I think anyone that knows me will know that that is something that definitely interests me. And it's actually been one of my main fields of interest. It's the intersection of two of my main fields of interest in life and my passions in life, which is, of course, studying religion and music. I'm a musician myself. And so when they come together, sparks fly in terms of my interest and my engagement with it. So I have done some videos that tackle that, like Sufi music and music and Jewish mysticism. I have another channel called Philip Holm where I post my music, but I also talk a lot about music. Sometimes I do videos very similar to the videos here on Let's Talk Religion, but covering music. Sometimes the history of music or the philosophy of music. So I did some videos I did one on Inayat Khan late last year, covering his philosophy and mysticism of music. I did one earlier on John Coltrane, the great jazz saxophone player, and his sort of perennialist, Hindu-inspired perspective on music and its spiritual components. So go check out that channel if you want to know more about that sort of stuff. Do you think Cody Rhodes is turning heel at SummerSlam? I wish I was still caught up with the wrestling thing. As a kid, I used to be really into the WWE. I haven't been since then, but I remember it as being very fun. But a heel turn is always fun. So I hope yes. Okay, this will have to be the last question, I think, because there's like 136 questions here. Maybe I'll have to do like a part 2 or do this again in the future, because clearly you have a lot of things you want to ask me. Crazy Dove, do you ever get into apologetics, the logical reasons for and against a religion's core claims? Not really. I love talking about religion. I love discussing it in certain environments with people that I enjoy talking with. I am violently uninterested in debates and kind of apologetic discussions in that way. I know that that's very popular on YouTube and on the internet generally, these kinds of, apologetics generally, but also these debates about God and about religion and who's right. And like that's so uninteresting to me, and something that I really never want to engage with. That's not my style when it comes to this topic. That's not the way that I want to educate. That's not the way that I want to personally engage with religion or philosophy or history. I prefer to do it the way that I do it here, and to have sometimes discussions, but discussion and debate are two different things. Anyway, that's all for now. I hope this was somewhat interesting. I feel like I can never do justice to these questions because the questions that I like to pick and try to answer are often quite complex and really require me to do like proper research, which means that I should just do a video on them and so these very off the cuff kind of short answers to very complex questions that require or that deserve more in-depth answers. I hope at least it's a little bit interesting, and that I provided you some company for the evening or morning or whatever. Thank you from beautiful Sweden. Hope to see you again in a future Q&A, but also in my next video. I have some stuff coming on Thomas Aquinas soon, a big video on Aquinas. Check out my recent video on Giordano Bruno. I'm quite proud of that video. I did it together with Angela Puca from Angela Symposium, and shot parts of it in Italy, in the places where he grew up, which was a beautiful experience, and I'm very proud of that video. So go check out the Bruno video. Look forward to the Aquinas video. I'm working on a script about the Jesuits. I'm working on stuff about a bunch of stuff. My Morocco videos should be coming out relatively soon. I really need to start working on that properly, but it's a lot of exciting stuff that I shot in Morocco that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you. So a lot of exciting things coming. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.